nutrient load. Back to sciencey words. Water with a high nutrient load. What kind of nutrients probably? Fertilizers. So if we were going to go do some science, what kind of nutrients do you think we would look for? We couldn't look for a specific fertilizer, but we could look for... Perfect, right? So when the scientists go do their water quality studies, that's exactly what they look for. They look for nitrates, nitrites, phosphorus, and there's a handful of others. But that's what tells us there's shit in the water. I love saying that. So, other things. LA has a really crazy industrial history, right? Just after World War II, most of South LA, or during World War II, most of South LA was converted to factories, manufacturing. Is that the cleanest industry in the world? Not in the slightest. And worse than putting stuff up in the air, do they put stuff on the ground? All the time. So they pollute in a crazy way. I don't know if this is going to work. This is my food dye. That's not going to work. If we could stir it around, it would be a little, oh wow, greater.
It's not real poop, right?
No. So when I used to teach this in high school, I'd get that all the time. The kids are like, that's real poop. I was like, how bad would my job be if that was real poop? Anyway, all of these industrial sites, now, if there's runoff, if there's a chemical spill, if there's anything happening on their property, that property is now forever designated as a brownfield or an industrial site. Because there's stuff in the ground. And if there's stuff in the ground, is it going to get in the water? Totally. Drinkable? Not nearly. What about that squirrel? That squirrel's not going to have a good time, right? By the way, do we see these impacts? When we go out, let's pretend we're going to go out into the world. We're going to look for these impacts. We now know we can look for nutrients. Can we look for other chemical pollutants? How do we identify what's happening from all this chemical pollution? How do we identify that in the water? Go ahead.
So look at like populations of like fish species or like different animals that live in.
That's perfectly right? We can look for animals that may be hurt, and if they're gone, we know we killed them in the back.
You can check for pH and other things in the water.
That's right. There's other corollaries in the water, right? So pH tells us what the hydrogen ion load is, and ions can also tell us what other chemicals are there. We can do all sorts of chemical tests to figure out what's in the water.
You got a new one?
I do have a new one, but...
Breaking up the dirt.
Okay. I was like, Chef Boyardee over here. That's okay. So back to, this is what water quality scientists are doing. They go out, they check the water, and they say, hey, we can see a nutrient load, or we can see a heavy metals load. We know that there's zinc in the water, and so that must mean that some of our manufacturers are doing some really nasty stuff. Because of the Clean Water Act, we do have some regulatory enforcement open to us. But again, not to go political, that really is dependent on enforcement. And if you have people in charge that don't want to enforce those laws, nothing's going to happen, right? A little cynical, but industry, commercial manufacturers, they tend to not do things willingly. They tend to do things when they're told to do them. So cleaning up their sites, there are still industrial sites that are heavily polluting the water in LA. And the only way they get stopped are from different organizations. Say, hey, we found there's nasty water coming off your property. You're in violation of the law. Let's get it together. Back to know your community organizations. There's lots of community organizations. Gila Bay does this kind of scientific study all the time. Friends of the Los Angeles River. If you're interested in some of the in-depth stuff, this is all actively happening today. Aside from industry, are other chemicals getting into the water? Aside from people making stuff, what other kinds of chemicals?
Car chemicals.
Car chemicals? I don't know if I have oil.
You don't have oil?
I should though, right?
Yeah. I saw oil in the river.
Did you guys see the sheen, right? Every time I go to the river, it's like breathtaking, but then like breathtaking. So I don't have any fudge. Normally put a little fudge in, it gets really gross. But cars, right? Our buddy Nick, who's also an environmental educator, used to say that every car drips oil. And it's true. No matter how well kept your car is, after a certain number of miles, some joint somewhere is coming loose and is actively dripping oil. Most mechanics worry when there's like a threshold. Not that they see 1 or 2 drips, they're like, there's too much oil. As an environmentalist, any oil worries me, right? They get into the water, they make it nasty. Let's pretend I just put in a bunch of fudge there. Consumable, certainly not. Environmental impact. What are the kinds of environmental impact are we going to have from hydrocarbons, oils, gases, those kinds of things getting into the water? We noted a chemical sheen. What else might happen?
Kills fish, gets on birds.
What's up?
Kills fish.
Kills fish, gets on birds, right? So, of the water bodies I pointed out, it's all the way to the first one. So the orange one all the way to the left is the Santa Monica Bay watershed. Just below that is the Dominguez Channel watershed. Have you guys ever been to Dominguez, that area? Wilmington, Torrance, are some of the largest oil refineries, production, all sorts of stuff. There is 1 or 2 active oil spills getting into the Dominguez Channel at any one time. Mostly because a lot of commercial and industrial manufacturing has control of the property there and gets to bounce around with enforcement. But it's just to say that, physical oil, aside from just making the water at a chemical level nasty, is still getting onto animals, it's still polluting ecosystems. So it's kind of crazy to think that all of the cars that we drive have these kinds of, extractive, where they get pulled out of the ground, they have these impacts, right? I'm being a little verbose. I will just say that there are other chemical inputs. We have blue for Windex. All the chemicals you use are part of this watershed and now contribute their own interesting things. Surfactants, right, break up the surface tension of the water. And now any insects that might depend on surface tension of the water, they gotta go find another place to live. We also put stuff on our lawns to keep it green. I have lots of chemicals. But it's just to look back and wonder, 100 years ago, the primary source of our water was the river. And in 100 years, we've now turned it to this soup. We call it urban runoff. The sciencey nerds people call it urban runoff. Just all the impacts of natural runoff mixed with the urban.
Do you want to put the balloon?
No, it's okay. You can put it down. Thank you very much, Michaela. Yeah. Round of applause for Amanda White. So I tend to get a little wordy about this because there's so many things to think about. But anyway, all of this stuff all of the stuff that makes its way into the storm drain system effectively becomes that soup, what we call urban runoff. And now scientists can start to ask really interesting things about that urban runoff. As I said, we can do water quality studies. We can go analyze the chemistry, what's in that water, and figure out how to absolve some of those nutrient loads or heavy metal loads, etc. We can also see down at the river other interesting things getting into the water, right? This happens after every major storm. The numbers are a little overwhelming. I think the last time I ran the numbers, and this might have been 2 years ago, it read something like there is more trash by weight going into the ocean every year, than there are whales by weight in the ocean. So if you ground up all the whales, you put them on one side of the scale, you put on the other side the amount of trash per year, right? Yeah, it's crazy, right? It's totally crazy. And it becomes sort of a problem that we don't really have a good answer for right now. There are people that are speculating all sorts of answers. Why don't we ban plastic bags? Maybe if we prevent some of that trash from going in, that might do some good, and it does. Do we still find this each and every time it rains? Right? There's other things. We can talk about banning styrofoam, and they are. Banning straws, doing all these kinds of things. But is that going to get rid of this problem? So now I wonder, right? It feels so overwhelming, exhausting. What do we do? What do we do? And I'm at this place where I think it's just that our everyday experience happens somewhere else. We very rarely see these things. So we don't have to think about them, and if we don't have to think about them, then we don't think about them. We think about, what does Facebook tell me, or what does my Instagram tell me, etc. But there are opportunities, right? There are ways of jumping in and getting involved. There's groups doing work on flood prevention and mitigation. I used to work for Tree People. So Tree People is trying to reimagine the city as a giant sponge. Why don't we actually capture some of that water as opposed to let it flow down into the storm root system? Heal the Bay is doing some of the heavy science on how do we track all this data? How do we make it make sense? There are lots of different opportunities to jump in. I know you guys are doing sort of a larger project. Where do we want to get ourselves involved as naturalists? Water is certainly one place that needs a lot of help. But this is really the outside part of the story, right? So when we think of outside water, when we think of rain, when we think of the watershed, that's this part of the story. The byproduct is urban runoff. How do we solve it? Well, we need your help. I don't have a good answer, right? I'm working through it myself. But definitely, perspective, thoughts, advice, help. And that's the Eddie Murphy Show. Yay! Ta-da!